with us today Michael Steirnagle, and we have been reviewing different artists on the internet, Beth, Bob, and I, and we have selected some people that we thought stood out and offered something different that we're not seeing in the mainstream, and we would really like to bring attention to these fine painters. Michael, I'd like you to give us a short background on you, and then I'm going to cut and just show a couple images that you sent me so people have a context of your painting. But we're calling this Taking the Mystery Out of Abstraction, and I know that we all have a lot of questions, and Michael has some answers for us today. So, Michael, take it away and let us know a little bit about your background.
Okay, sure, thanks. And thanks for inviting me too, I appreciate this. My background is such that I used to be an illustrator, and I worked in the illustration business in the 70s and the 80s, did a lot of album covers, a lot of book jackets, and back in my day I was an airbrush illustrator. And as an airbrush illustrator, everything was masked off and you isolated all your different shapes, so you ended up rendering shapes to whether it was a saxophone or a cake or a box of Cheerios or whatever it was, because I was a commercial illustrator. And then computers entered the picture, and I decided that I wanted to get out of that business because, well, first of all, it was illustration business changed dramatically, and photography took over and computers took over. And so the number of illustrators out there competing for the jobs became, more and more illustrators, fewer and fewer jobs. So I saw the writing on the wall, decided to move into fine art, and I switched from, before I got out of illustration, I switched to pastels, just to show some transition, how I got to oils and how I get to what I'm doing now. Because it's quite a remarkable transition, because I started with masking off every little individual shape. So if you look at my work now, where it's much, much looser and much more abstracted in nature, coming from a venue of an airbrush that was very exacting, was quite a leap for me. It took a long time. Anyway, I did it by going into pastels, and I'm a firm believer in pastels being really a good way to break into painting. It's basically the same thing, except it's a dry medium. I went to Art Center, and then I took a teaching job about 25 years ago. So I'm a full-time member of a college faculty, and I'm getting ready to retire from that and just paint. And then I moved into oils, and now I just work basically for myself. I teach figure drawing, figure painting, head drawing, so I'm a people person. And so, as such, I wanted to really learn how to paint people, and now I have done that. I know how to draw people very well and teach people how to paint people, and that was sort of my background. I don't do illustration anymore. I just show in galleries around the country. I've done children's books and that sort of thing too.
Some of the pieces that Michael sent, I'm just showing them early on in our broadcast so that people will have an opportunity to know the context of some of the things that Michael's talking about. And then if he desires that later in the broadcast, I can pull these up again and we could talk about an individual piece. And
colors are a bit bright on that one, aren't they?
yeah, I don't know if the computer makes things a little bit more intense or not, but definitely can see the abstraction. And these are the things. Can you talk about it now, Michael? Like for instance, this piece, what you were thinking about, and explain your thoughts about abstraction a little bit.
Yeah, yes, I can. Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I started to get students that would come to me and they would want to learn to loosen up in their work, and of course that's always been kind of everybody's challenge. And the thing about painting figurative is that people don't want to buy paintings of people they don't know. And unless you're really well known, you're a famous illustrator, I mean, a famous artist, it doesn't matter. But in terms of people wanting to buy work for their homes, people don't want to buy paintings of other people. So I had to start to venture into an area to try to figure out how to create paintings utilizing the figure and the human form in a way that took away from the focal point being the person and moved more into the delivery of the paint, you know, the application of the paint and the approach to assembling the figure, if you will. And so I started to experiment with with different methods of playing with shapes and playing with relationships of shapes and see how much I could get away with abstracting the figure. And when I say abstracting the figure, what I'm really talking about is manipulating the shapes of shadows and patterns and colors and not of objects. In other words, I started to get away from painting stuff, and I started to learn how to paint shapes and then play with the shapes within the form. And it's a little difficult to explain with words. But my ultimate goal here was to try to figure out how to blur the line between abstraction and representational painting. And the more I started to experiment with this, and I've been working on it for a number of years, the more I started to explore this, the more people started to come to me and say, well, they want to learn how to loosen up. And the term loosening up is totally a misnomer, because loosening up for most people is about learning how to do brushwork and not stay within the lines, right? And that's not how I approach loosening up. I approach loosening up from a standpoint of playing with the shapes, whether they're hard-edge shapes, whether they're soft-edge shapes, it doesn't really matter, and assembling them more as a mosaic, if you will. You know, if you think about a mosaic, and I used to do mosaics, strangely enough, way back when I was younger, and I love playing with mosaics. So it's not unsimilar to working that way. But the trick is, it is very difficult for me to do this, is to create something that's abstract enough, but still recognizable enough. Because I find that most people like to have the figure, but they also like the abstraction. So I tell students, I say, well, you go into a gallery, abstract gallery, and you're going to respond to one or more of these paintings more than you are other ones. They're not all going to be as likable to you. So why is that? Why is it that you respond to one painting over another? So I started to venture into looking at composition and working with shapes and things like that. And I go back and forth. I go back and forth to more realistic painting and more abstracted painting. And it's a quandary. If you're going to paint the figure, how many figures can you paint with big hats on them or their backs, you know, without getting the faces in there? So really it started from a standpoint of not trying to paint people, but painting the figure within an abstract composition. That's where it started.
All right. Yeah, I noticed that the pattern is a big thing for you. When you started talking about that, or the mosaics, it's really obvious. You are painting the shapes and the color. You shapes of color. The one on the figure that I had selected before, I could select again. It'll come up in a few minutes, I guess. That is interesting to me because it's so it's emphasized with pattern, and it's almost. Actually, I looked at this painting a number of times before I realized it was a woman laying there with her feet in, I guess, a pool or the beach in the water. And I didn't even see that for a while because I just saw these unusual shapes. It's kind of like some of those things they show you where you can see the cow one way, and then if you turn it another way, it's two women, or two
It's
men.
just interesting, Daryl. I was looking at Michael's website with a friend last night, and that picture that you showed there just knocked her socks off. And that's really dramatic. And one of the things I wanted to ask Mike is whether he used a live model for that, painting from life, or whether he just dreamed it up, or how did it happen? Because it looks like a hard pose to stage as compared to, say, the Dogfather or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. You remember the Dogfather? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. The Dogfather was painted from life, with the exception of the dog. The dog was an afterthought. This figure was painted from. I hired a model. I usually hire models, and I don't ever work from other people's photographs. I hire my own. I pose them, and then I utilize the photographs and play with the photographs in a way that I would want to do. The reason for that part you're talking about, that back there, Daryl, with the water and stuff, you'll notice that everything in the background where the water is and the girl's legs kind of just, they start to pixelate together, if you will, lack of a better term. Large pixels though they are, the legs and the feet and the water all of a sudden start to break up, as if, you know, when you're looking in water that's rippling, and you see the shapes of water that are the colors within the water, they're bouncing off of each other. That's kind of the effect I wanted to achieve. And interestingly, when I started doing these water things, I realized, oh, that really works with water, but it also works without water. I can do it with anything. So I started to play with these shapes and push them outside of where the leg is. You know, flesh over here, flesh over there, blue over here. And you'll notice that most of the sharper edges are around the hat and the girl's face, and everything else becomes more blurred. My way of blurring, I don't use blurred edges. I don't take a brush and blur the edges. I blur the edges by bringing shapes close together in value and color, which creates a soft area except where you want the eye to go. So what I'm doing is I'm controlling my composition and where the eye goes based on the tightness of those little shapes. So it becomes very abstracted in one area and very tight in another area.
So how do you know where to put everything?
Well, okay. Now that's where I get to, and I do a lot of these workshops around the country with this abstraction, realism to abstraction. You know, bridging the gap. I've called one of them. This called taking the mystery out. It's about composition, and I use structures. All my paintings are designed around a structure, and this has, you know, been used throughout history. And a structure can be a triangle. It can be vertical bands of color, like in landscapes. It can be cityscapes, you know, like buildings. Landscapes are horizontal bands of color. So depending on my structure, I tighten up and push the colors in certain areas to keep the eye moving. If you go to that one with the Dogfather, you'll notice the I don't know if you can pull that one up, Daryl, or not.
Yeah.
But there's a large triangular shape that holds the whole thing together, and you can see that, and that's that hierarchy of design where everything is pushed up towards the triangle at the top where the man's head is. And the dog there, the Russian wolfhound, was an afterthought. It was based on two things. One was enforcing the composition. You'll notice the repeating triangular shapes, the man's knees, the triangular shape on the dog, the overall triangular shape of the horizontal orange at the bottom, the angle of the legs going up to the head, and the angle on the side of the dog going up to the head. Well, that's what I was trying to do, and so the dog fit that motif exactly. But it's not just for design purposes. I also asked myself, what kind of dog would go in there? And he looked like a kind of a Russian mafia sort of guy that was posing for me. So I stuck this Russian wolfhound in there, and it makes for a great composition. So, and the other aspect of this is a motif. Okay, now, a motif, other people use different words for it, but it's a repeating image. Now, I won't say necessarily a pattern, but a repeating shape that it repeats itself throughout the composition. In this case, it happened to be the same as the structure, which is a triangle. Okay, those other ones, the last one you looked at with the girl in the pool, you notice the little shapes of the her pattern in her dress. Those little pattern shapes, they kind of pop into the pool area, and they pop on her dress. So that's the motif that keeps repeating and helps hold the composition together.
Yeah, I like that aspect a lot. I've talked to people before, and they're talking about drawing, and they say every painting has to be a good drawing in it, but I think what they're really saying is every painting really, and that's why it's confusing. The word drawing means so many different things. To some people, it's like rendering, and other people, drawing really means putting things in the right spot. But I think the term that really should almost be used is design. That it's not about drawing; it's about the design. Everything is in the right place with the design. And like you're talking about, you're concentrating on what the design looks like. That's important for you, and I think it should be for all painters personally. But the one thing for me that kills a painting the quickest of anything is that there isn't design, and that it is just like you're saying, a painting of people or a painting of objects and things. So when you can get away from painting objects and things and allow your mind just to see the shapes and the design of the aspect like you were describing, then you can play with a motif, which could be an overall shape or some kind of pattern or any other kind of visual play that
sure, like I was saying, like I was saying, when you go into a gallery, okay, you respond to not every image the same way. Okay, why is it that you respond to certain images over other images? Well, the reason for that is we respond first. Our brains respond first to abstraction, and second to subject matter. Now, subject matter is important to a lot of people, but without the composition, the subject matter can lay flat. There's so many, and it's very frustrating for me lately because there's so much emphasis on rendering and realism at the expense of concept and composition. And I have nothing against somebody wanting to render a figure so tightly and everything else. But to be honest with you, that in itself is quite boring. And what you really are going to respond to in a painting first is the way it's assembled, that is, the way it's designed. And so then you can go into the subject matter. It doesn't matter whether you're painting a figure, a landscape, a still life, an abstraction, doesn't matter what it is. It still has the same principles because the brain, reacts the same way. We respond to shapes. We respond to balance. We respond, if you look at architecture and the way that, homes are designed, it's all the same. It runs the gamut throughout our lives. Where in painting, a lot of times these days, it's gone two different ways. One is, a lot of people who just want to paint like Jeremy Lipking or somebody who is a master at painting realism, but he's also a master at design. But when he gives these workshops, he talks about how to do the rendering, how to how to paint the process, how to do what he does, but only on a skill level. For me, what I'm trying to do is not teach people how I paint, but rather how I think and how I assemble shapes and design.
No.
So people can paint whatever they want to paint in any way they want to paint, but the principles of design and composition are the same whether you're working abstractly or representationally.
Yeah, I mean the abstraction, and people say abstract like it's some scary thing that we can't obtain. Abstraction really is about design, and then if you want to make your design like come down to something very foundational and very rendered, you can. But if you want to make the design, jump outside of the box and playing with the shapes and the color and the design, I do think it's more engaging. In my new book, I wrote that abstraction is important because it makes the viewer participate. It makes them join items in their mind to make sense of things. I believe the more we can make the viewer participate, the more personal the painting becomes to the viewer. And I think that's really true, because some paintings, they just give you everything. And when they give you everything, you look at it and you're done. But if you can look at a painting and then you have to like, oh, that's this. And there's this amount of discovery and then participation, and my mind has to work at it. My mind has to put things together. Like even a movie where we're constantly thinking, where's the plot going? Is that the guy that is the killer, or is this person the killer? Where's the drama? And so abstraction allows us to engage the painter in a much, I believe, more deep and powerful way than we ever could with just giving something that looks painted edge to edge.
Sure, yeah, and the viewer, for me, but it could be on two levels as far as I'm concerned. Participate in the painting, not only in its physical sense of colors and shapes that you help to assemble, in your mind, that he's given you the parameters in which you are to interpret, but also on a conceptual level, like putting in the Russian wolfhound, okay, to conceptualize it slightly. So it's not just a picture of somebody or a picture of a pretty landscape, okay. So I think that always should have some sort of story. But I came from an illustrator's background. See, I did children's books, and so I love to tell stories. And so every one of my paintings, I like to tell a little bit of a story, or not tell the story, but invite the viewer to interpret the story themselves.
Yeah, NC Wyeth was very big on that. He wanted people to feel like they walked into the room. You could tell the man put his hat and his cane up on the coat rack, and then he threw his jacket over here. You could almost sense the presence of the man.
Sure,
Beth,
but he was from...
Beth, do you have a couple questions for Michael about abstraction?
Sure. All I can think of when I hear all that you've said is you're creating a feast for the eyes. So it's almost like inviting the viewer to a banquet and of colors and shapes and a story, and it's very rich, and I really enjoy looking at your paintings. And and you've already told us a little bit that you've gone from rendering realistic figures and subjects to a more abstract, and I get from your passion and enthusiasm that you're really enjoying what you're doing. Is that correct?
Oh, I absolutely do. Yeah. And it's a process that's it's a search. I gave up years ago trying to. Well, I thought I gave up years ago trying to paint like other people. We're all guilty of that, and there's nothing wrong with that because you learn from other people. People have imitated what I do. I've imitated what other people do. I can give you a whole list of people you know, all the way down the line. Even C.F. Payne, who's up there in your area, you know, who was a friend of mine, you know, I even painted like him for a while, learned how to do that. Well, after a while, I realized, well, I got good at copying everybody else's stuff. I could figure out how they did it, but it wasn't my art. It wasn't art. It was learning how a craft that somebody else invented.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so I started. That's why I started to do this. It's like, what is my voice all about? And I didn't have a clue, to be honest with you, because as an illustrator, you don't have any ideas. Your job is to solve other people's visual problems. So when I started to learn how to paint, I had to start learning to dig for my own voice. Now, I'm getting closer to it. I'm getting closer to finding my own voice. But still, it creeps in, you know. Other people's stuff still creeps in, you know. Nothing wrong with that either, because we're all influenced by other people, you know. Where I don't want to go, however, is into real conceptual contemporary art, because I think a lot of what they've done has done a huge disservice to painting, because basically they have thrown out the rules. You know, we throw out the rules of color and design and things that the brain responds to, and what they're looking for is things that maybe create angst or create a discourse because they haven't been done before. You know, under the guise of trying to do things that have never been explored before. Well, I think we can do things that have never been explored before, that are seemingly different, but still follow some of the foundational guidelines of painting structure, you know, like those kinds of things.
Like your use of pattern that you've brought in, the checkerboards and the different. It almost looks like a fabric, or you incorporate the floor, and you see that woven through the entire painting, and that to me seems unique.
Yeah, and that's part of the motif thing that I was talking about. Now, Gustav Klimt did that, you know. A lot of painters incorporated those kinds of things, you know, and we all pick up on a little bit of that. I've been guilty of finding a little bit of pattern that I like over here, and but not just for pattern's sake. I try to come up with a reason for putting it. What I don't like collage artists. You know, I don't like collage because, well, I have this thing about it. I'm a purist as far as painters go, so I don't like mixed media and stuff. There's nothing wrong with it, but there's a tendency to lean on somebody else's work too much, I think, and you know, rather than
using somebody's ideas is a lot different than trying to paint like them. You know, if you get into another artist's way of thinking and processing, it still has to come through you when you paint. But if you're just painting, you know, to paint another painting like this person or that person, then to me that's pretty much a waste of time for a painter, because part of becoming a painter is creating something new, creating your own unique voice.
Right, and what an exciting thing that is, to see something different, to see yourself, your own voice on a canvas. And I think that's really should be the desire of every artist.
Yeah.
Well, I think so, but I think it's also part of the reason that we're all a little bit erotic, you know. We tend to, because I don't know about you, but I tend to lose faith sometimes in what I'm doing. If you listen to, which I've been guilty of, if you listen to people too much, people, you know, your friends, the people come into your studio, or what sells in your galleries, you know, you listen to that too much, then you start losing faith in your own vision, and that's a tough thing to overcome, because we all like to sell work, we all like to get strokes, we all, you know, however, you still have to prove to yourself.
Hey, Bob, I'd like to hear a couple of things that you'd like to ask Michael. And I know you're over there thinking about everything he said and processing it. But what about these?
You know, I think there's both aspects. you know, if painting is a way of expressing yourself, there's nothing wrong with talking to yourself. And if you don't talk to yourself once in a while, you're probably not normal. But if you talk only to yourself, you never sell a painting, you never seek other people's opinion of your painting, then you're really missing out a lot on what it means to be a human being if you're only talking to yourself. So I think it's an interesting balance. If you just paint for yourself and your own vision internally, and you never seek any response in anybody else, it's
you think we're missing something.
less than being a normal human being. You want to be a hermit, maybe. That's not really what I want to do, right? So but on the other hand, I don't want to say what sells and let's do more of that until finally I'm a Hallmark card guy, right? Just trying to sell pretty pictures, right? That doesn't make any. There's no satisfaction in that, zero. So I think it's an interesting.
I don't think that we should ever make money any kind of driving force towards our painting. I think that's just...
Well, making money isn't the answer.
Clouds the wall.
If nobody cares enough about your stuff or likes your stuff well enough to buy it, then you haven't communicated with them.
No, I think you
haven't communicated with them.
Good company buy it.
If they do buy it, if they do buy your work, you know you've at least communicated to one person at some level. Now, you mentioned to me you once sold a picture because it looked like somebody you didn't know. So maybe the person got the message. It wasn't the message you intended to send, but they got a message from your work.
You know, if you never sell a painting, then you're in really good company because Van Gogh, though he tried really hard, as a lot of painters do, never sold any work, and then he finally sold one.
So he pushed on himself too, right?
and so
he was one frustrated individual, and my object of my life is not to frustrate myself incessantly, right? I want to have a balance.
Michael, what do you have to say to that? I think you probably have some thoughts on that. Hear your response, Michael.
Well, there's obviously not one formula for every artist, and it depends on your temperament. But guys like Van Gogh and Francis Bacon and so many of them that you'd be hard pressed to call them normal and well connected to the human race. They even guys like Lucian Freud who spent 12 hours a day painting, in his studio with 3 different models at a time up into his 80s. I don't think you could say he had a real balanced life, but he did what he wanted to do, and he was comfortable with that, whether he sold any or not. Turns out he ended up selling things for millions. But I understand what Bob's saying too. So I think it has to do with, well, what are your goals and what's your comfort level is. You can end up being the richest artist in the world, a la Thomas Kincaid, and he ended up a very miserable person, and ended up passing away, not because of the art he did, of course, but he wanted to do something else, and the same is true. You mentioned N.C. Wyeth. N.C. Wyeth could not make it as a fine artist. He was always an illustrator, and he was very frustrated because he couldn't find his own acceptance in the world, in the art world, for him going off and doing his own things. They were all about wanting him to come back and do illustration. But he was miserable for that, and he suffered a lot of depression for it, just as Mr. Kincaid did, and just what a lot of people did. And a lot of that is because they didn't allow themselves, or the market didn't allow themselves, or whatever it is, to explore their own voice. But it has to do with temperament. Person to person, it's going to vary, distinctly. I have a friend of mine who says, well, you got to always, you always got to market, and you got to, let's put balloons on the sign outside the studio, when we have an open house. I'm going balloons, I'm just like,
yeah.
But that's what you like to do. but she likes to put balloons up there, and God bless her, and I love her to death. And she's a marketing person, you know, and I don't know how to do that stuff. My goal is to try to get to what I'm trying to really accomplish. Even if I don't sell, I'll paint till the day I die, even if I don't sell another painting. But I kind of need to sell some art too, so that speaks to what Bob was talking about. Got to live in the real world, right, Bob? Well, what you're talking about there is the difference between operating in a right brain mode and left brain mode, you know. And I talk a lot about this. You know, as an artist, you know, you have to function much more in the right brain than the left brain. The analytical side, which is the left brain, you know, that's the marketing side, you know. But to walk that tightrope, you know. And that's what we do. And walking the tightrope between practicality and really what you want to do as far as exploring your own work and letting the market find you. You have to create your own market if you're going to move out into a direction that is already not part of the marketplace. And that's called innovation, and that's always risky. Now, where I don't want to go is, and what I object to, is the real contemporary stuff. How in the world, and I judge a lot of shows, how in the world do I judge a show of contemporary paintings and contemporary work that is not based on a lot of the principles that I was raised with and trained with, and I went to art center, and you know, but those are more traditional kinds of places. You know, I'll give you an example. Damien Hirst, you know, who in his London gallery, he went into the gallery one time and it was raining outside, and he sat down and he took off his raincoat and he put it. There was no coat rack, so he put it in the corner there and talked to his gallery director. And when he left, he forgot to take his raincoat. Somebody came in and said, "Well, what's that?" And they said, "Well, that's Damien Hirst." And they sold it for $85,000. So you know. So how do you? Crazy. Yeah, and so if you're judging a show and somebody's brought their raincoat in and they've thrown it on the floor there as part of their piece, now how in the world am I supposed to judge the quality or the integrity or the artistic merit of a piece without some basis that is not based at all on any of the foundation things that we've been teaching students for all these centuries, and now it seems to be ignored, almost to the point, to be honest with you, in some of the art schools, they dismiss drawing. They talk about drawing as getting in the way, actually getting in the way of creating and finding your own true voice. Now, to me, that's like telling somebody in music, you know, well, you don't need to know how to learn how to play this musical instrument, because that's going to get in the way of your expression.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. When I was in 9th grade, I was taking some education courses at the Carnegie Mellon University, and their art group there was 100% abstract expressionism at the time. They thought anything that looked representational was mere illustration. That's basically what they said. And that's one of the reasons I got off the art train as a sophomore in high school, because it's something I just didn't understand. And
that's right.
Yeah, it just was just something as is, you know, you're back to the same old square again,
Sure.
Throwing paint at a canvas because you're angry or there's angst involved. And it's just something I never felt.
Me either.
You know, I don't say there's anything wrong with people want to do that. If anybody buys it and likes it or generates it and has satisfaction internally about it, that's fine. That's great. But it's not me. It's not what I particularly want to do.
I think that, you know, there are definitely maybe
documentary
rules that we have with painting. But as soon as we make hard and fast rules, then somebody's going to be out there and ready to break them, and for good reason. I've always continued to say that, you know, Cezanne said we should always push forward to find the new things. and I agree with that wholeheartedly.
My
But
kids
I've
used to
seen
tell
where
me,
some of the abstraction has gotten to the place where, people make these constructions and they'll do something gross and defecate on them or something like that and call it artwork. And I don't really call that artwork anymore. And I think we have got off a good direction. And that's where we've hurt art. And I think that's why sometimes people don't want to buy paintings, is because you made art into a joke. But I'd like to get back to painting a little bit. And Michael, you talked about painting intuitively. You mentioned that earlier on when we were talking. And I was wondering if you could describe to us what that means to you as you were talking about abstraction. What does it mean to paint intuitively to you?
Well, it means to, for me, it means to ignore subject matter and just respond to shapes, color, and design and value. And the best way to go about doing this, for me, even if I'm working on a figure or something, is to turn the painting upside down, and work on it upside down. And when you do that, I don't know if you've ever done any of that, but it's a remarkable experience, because after you work on it for a while, the subject matter entirely goes away, because unless your brain is trying to consciously reverse it into a right side up painting, which you try to do in the first place, because it's a right brain left brain thing, and then you start to see shapes, and you start to see things that are I start to feel I need to put this value over here. This needs some balance. It's too confusing. My design's off. My structure, I'm losing my structure. So it's not based on the subject matter. If it's right side up, the subject matter will get in the way of that, because you don't want to lose. And this is where a lot of my paintings started, by the way. I'd work on paintings for days upside down and not turn them right side up. And then you turn them right side up and you go, oh my goodness, I had no idea it looked like this. And invariably, I liked it better, because, and then when I put it right side up, then I go back to start painting stuff, you start painting the figure again, or whatever. And then you lose the intuition. So it's a feeling thing, but it's all based on an awareness. It's not just feeling, but it's based on awareness of learning about balance and design and color and and that sort of thing.
Okay, and another question I had for you, looking back at your paintings, that they seem to be a little bit more hard edge and shape driven. You seem to use very vibrant colors also. And what was your preference for these more vibrant colors? What did that offer into your abstract paintings that you liked, and these big shapes that you're painting?
Well, I tend to use harder edged shapes because the shapes are easier to define. It necessitates making those shapes the absolute correct value. If you cannot blend an edge together and make it work, you have to create the exact value and put it next to another value or another color to do what you want it to do. If you want that edge to go away, then values have to be very close together. They can still be hard edge. Okay. And then you could see sizes too, large shapes, small shapes. It was easier to design that way. I paint soft edges too, but for the most part, I spend a lot of time mixing on my palette the correct value and color, and then I'll hold it up there and I'll put it down with the palette, and I have to see if that's the right color first. So most of my work is done here on the palette, and then when it's the right color and value, then I'll mix up enough of it and I'll scoop it up with my brush. I don't paint. I don't do this. I don't just, I scoop up the paint and I put it down. I apply it. you know, and I'll put 1, 2, 3 strokes, whatever it is, leave it alone. Wipe my brush, mix up the next value, next color, could be next to it or somewhere else, so that you can, each one of those little shapes, you can be expressive, you know, how you apply the paint. And some of it's done in underpainting too. A lot of my work is done in the underpainting, you know, transparent part. Letting that come through. A lot of those shapes you see on there, that's all done in underpainting, like with transparent color and using liquid or just mineral spirits so it'll dry quickly. And using transparent color and then coming in with your opaques over the top of it and isolating those transparent colors behind it so you get transparent and opaque on top. And that's how you have those hard edges. You know, you put an opaque on top of an area that's transparent, and the juxtaposition of those two, value-wise and color-wise. You might put a blue next to an orange. So that's how I got into the real strong colors. Pushing complements in areas.
That's really interesting. Long ago and far away, I was in the automotive paint business. And automotive designers particularly love to use the transparency of the paint to accentuate the sculptural nature of the car or to exaggerate the sculptural nature of the car with the chatoyance or flop that you get when you look through a transparent paint at an angle as against looking through at that same paint directly head on. And that's a really important part of the styling of accentuating the shape change. And it's interesting to see that might be applied in a painting too, with the underpainting and the transparent color above it. You don't have to go all the way back to medieval 30 layers of real thin transparent paint, because I can see you haven't done that, although I haven't seen the pictures. I haven't seen your work personally, but I can see that it's not looking through 20 layers of varnish. But the transparency is interesting.
Yeah, the way light works, because I teach a lot of color theory and stuff, and you know, there's two methods the way light works. One is like what you look at on the screen, where light is coming from behind it and illuminating everything, so everything's much brighter that way, right? You can't achieve the luminosity of a television screen on a painting. So the reason for that is one is done with transparents, you know, and the other is done with opaque. So in painting, when you lay down your darks and your underpainting and transparents, you know, the light on a white canvas, you know, the sun, the light comes through, and it comes through all those different layers. Say sometimes I put on 3 or 4 layers of transparent color to create different effects and textures and stuff. And the light goes through the orange, and it goes through the yellow, and it goes through the blue, you know. Hits the white and bounces back up, and it illuminates it as if it was coming through a screen, you know, a video screen. Obviously not the same intensity, but the same principle. And then when you start adding the opaques, next to that, that light, you know, hits the opaques and bounces right off. Right, so you got one light right next to it where you have transparent, and that light's going all the way through, hitting the canvas, coming back. So it's a completely different effect. So when you put them next to one another, the effect is remarkable, and it's an underused technique that a lot of painters have ignored. I'm not saying this is the only way to work. A lot of people use opaques on everything, and they're beautiful, but utilizing some transparency in the underpainting can make a lot more depth in your painting.
Interesting.
Michael, we got a few more minutes here, but I was going to try to pull from some of your years of teaching and ask you that, what do you think was most impactful? Not that there was just one thing, but what do you feel was one thing that was very impactful to your students that you might help somebody watching this interview with you today that you could pass?
Well, for my students, because I teach in college, I always tell them everything you learn to do by hand also learn to do on a computer, you know. Because the reality, like Bob was talking about, the reality of it is there's a lot more money to be made for a lot more people working in computer art. And so I always tell them to do that if you're not really interested in being a starving artist and going into contemporary art. If you have a thing for that, that's fine. But I always tell them to go after computers first and learn as much as you can in foundation studies as possible. The factories, I call them factories now. The master's degree factories that they have for artists these days. You go into graduate schools, and they're cranking out people with master's degrees, students with master's degrees, and they learn to do what's happening in the contemporary art world now, and they turn around, and the only thing they can do with it is turn around and teach. So they're the ones that are taking the teaching jobs because they won't hire anybody outside of having a master's degree, at least. You can't get anything. If you're a good painter, a good artist, and you don't have a master's degree, you're out of luck. So the way to get a master's degree is get in one of these programs, and these programs, for the most part, are based on teaching people to do what's out there now, what they did. So it creates this catch-22. All the students learn to do what the teachers taught, and then they turn around and get teaching jobs and teach what their students. So it's created this. It's a loop. They're all doing the same thing, and that's what's causing the art market to devolve, as far as I'm concerned. So what I tell them to do is, you can't get it if you're going after a master's degree and you want to learn how to draw and actually paint, go someplace also where you can actually learn how to draw and paint, so that you'll have more versatility to do what you want to do rather than what they're telling you to do.
Right.
That's
Like C.W. Mundy says, to go to the well, go to the source, and study with artists that you love and appreciate. And
right. That's right.
That's what you're saying. That's really interesting.
And
Bob, go ahead.
There's a lot of us out there that feel the same way. Most of the really big artists you'll see now, particularly figurative artists, they were former illustrators. The Steve Houstons, all those guys, and even Jeremy Lipkins. They all started out as illustrators, and they learned their craft, and now they have opened up a whole new world in the fine art area that's just as legitimate, but is completely separate from what's happening in the contemporary conceptual world.
Yeah, I agree. Well, it looks like we lost Daryl.
Yeah, what happened to Daryl?
Somewhere along the way. So, Bob, is there anything else you want to say?
Hey, I'm interview, and I really appreciate your comments. I like your work, but especially I've enjoyed hearing your approach to it, and it's real inspiring to me. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely.
Well,
I especially appreciate what you said about modern art as well, and your frustration there. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I appreciate it. It's fun to talk about. That's a passion of mine. And if anybody is interested in joining my website, if they're going to listen to this, they just go to my website, which is just steirnagle.com. Spelling is STEIRNAGLE.
Hey, Michael, I want to apologize. I got knocked out of the Hangout, and so I'm finishing up our broadcast by just saying thank you so much for coming today. You've opened our eyes to a lot of new ideas that we can all think about as painters and apply to our work.